This is a video tutorial for Phil 123 Module 1 on the topic of Socrates and the Apology. A little bit of background about what's going on in the Apology. The Apology is an example of what we call a Platonic dialogue. It's called the Platonic dialogue because it's written in dialogue form in the way that you would find a play, for example, written. And it's called a Platonic dialogue because its author is the Greek philosopher Plato. Now, something to know about the Platonic dialogues, and this dialogue in particular. Their author Plato was himself a student of Socrates, perhaps Socrates' greatest student in real life. As a matter of historical record, Plato studied under Socrates. Socrates himself is famous for never having actually written anything down. He would simply get in arguments with folks, and occasionally people would write down what he said, or at least a faithful version of what he said. The Apology is generally considered to be a more or less accurate version of what Socrates said at his particular trial around 400 BC in Athens, Greece. It's not a word-for-word transcript. You should not believe that everything that you read in the Apology was something that Socrates himself actually said, or that anything that you see performed or said in the video rendition of Socrates' trial is exactly perfect. But nonetheless, it's generally agreed that the Apology is a fairly faithful account of what Socrates said. What's happening in the Apology is that Socrates is on trial, and he's on trial for his life. He's been accused of a series of crimes, most notably the crimes of not believing in the gods of the city of Athens and of corrupting the youth of the city. Now, one thing to know that's important here is kind of interesting if you just focus on the name, the Apology. The word apology does not mean for the Greeks what it means for us native English speakers. In English, an apology is something like giving an account after one's admitted wrongdoing. Right? When you apologize, you admit that you've done something wrong and you try to make amends, you try to make things right, you're contrite, and so on. Socrates is not apologizing in that sense. He has not admitted that he has done anything wrong. For the Greeks, the word apology means something like a defense. And indeed, that's what Socrates is doing. He's been accused by a series of folks of various crimes, and he is currently defending himself. Socrates' trial proceeds in two stages. In the first stage, his accuser comes forth, announces the charges, and makes the case that Socrates is really guilty. Then Socrates has the opportunity to defend himself, which he does. Once the defendant has been convicted, if the defendant has been convicted, then the trial moves to a sentencing phase. The accuser gets to propose a punishment, Socrates gets to propose a punishment, the jury of their peers decides which punishment is more appropriate and hands down the sentence. So with the first stage of the trial, there's a jury of peers, 501 Athenian citizens to be exact, much more than our own familiar 12-person jury. 501 Athenians are Socrates' jury. Now here's what we know. Socrates is accused. He's ultimately convicted, fairly narrowly, right? It wasn't an overwhelming majority that upheld Socrates' conviction. At one point, Socrates suggests if just 30 votes had swung the other way, he would be an innocent man. The other thing that we know is that Socrates is ultimately not only convicted, but sentenced to death. Socrates pulls a kind of neat trick, and it's a neat enough trick that I want to focus on it a little bit, and it's reproduced a bit in the handout. Socrates is memorable for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that he's terribly quotable. And some of the quotes that I've got reproduced on that first lecture handout for Module 1 reflect that. Socrates is famous for suggesting that he is the wisest of all men. Why? Well, a friend of Socrates consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle at Delphi was supposed to have direct contact with the Greek gods, and thus if you asked a question when you went to Delphi and the oracle conversed with the gods, the answer that you got was supposed to be absolutely certain. Okay? The oracle apparently suggested that Socrates was the wisest of all men. Okay? And Socrates found this rather puzzling, for Socrates is also famous for denying that he knows anything at all. Socrates would frequently and repeatedly deny that he has knowledge. How then could Socrates be the wisest of all men? Well, and this is where it gets a little cute. The claim was that other people, for example, Socrates' accusers, wrongly thought that they had knowledge. They falsely believed that they knew what they were talking about. The reason that Socrates is the wisest of all men is because even though he doesn't know anything, he at least knows that he doesn't know anything. If that sounds a little too cute, it probably is, but go with it for the time being. Another reason that Socrates is famous, and one of the reasons I really want to focus on him right now, is because of Socrates' use of logic in his arguments. Okay, Socrates was a master philosopher. He's famous for declaring that the unexamined life is not worth living. And even though Socrates wound up going to his grave for being a philosopher, nonetheless, he was unwilling to give up examining his life, questioning whether he had knowledge and questioning the meaning of concepts and so on and so forth. There's various stages in the Apology where we can see Socrates using logic in his arguments. One of Socrates' famous positions is that no one would ever knowingly do harm to another person. They would never willingly and knowingly do harm. Why? Because Socrates thought if you do harm to another person, or to many people, it's that much more likely that it's going to come back and harm you. And of course, nobody willingly harms themselves, or knowingly or willingly harms themselves, Socrates thought. So, Socrates has an argument that these charges are baseless and that he doesn't deserve punishment. Because if Socrates did, in fact, harm the youth of Athens, he must have done so unknowingly or unwillingly. He must have been forced or coerced or drunk or something like that. If that's the case, then his accusers are lying and Socrates doesn't deserve punishment. And similarly, if Socrates didn't do harm willingly or knowingly, then he doesn't deserve punishment. So either way, Socrates does not deserve to be punished. Okay? A similar argument, well, maybe not a similar argument, but another interesting argument that Socrates runs, and this, I should say something else. This is related to the other video lecture, other video tutorial on the concept of validity. The arguments that are being reproduced on the handout with the numbered premises and conclusion, these are logically valid arguments. If their premises are true, then the conclusion is true as well. So if you accept that the argument is valid, and you accept that all the premises are true, you have to accept the truth of the conclusion. Here's another argument that Socrates put forward during the sentencing portion of his trial. Socrates argued that his punishment should fit his crime. And since Socrates spent his life doing nothing but trying to better Athens and its citizens, his punishment should reflect that. Accordingly, right, if Socrates should be punished at all, he should receive a just punishment, not an unjust one. And if Socrates should receive a just punishment, well, then he deserves to be fed for free for the remainder of his life. At one point, Socrates suggests that he should receive free meals at the Pyrrhonium. Okay, this was a kind of gymnasium, but also a kind of living house, a place that would serve food and had baths and spas and such things. Usually, it was the Olympic athletes and guests of state that would get to stay here and eat and reside for free. It was a great honor reserved for the very privileged. Socrates argued that this should be his punishment. After all, the punishment should fit the crime, and all Socrates did in his life was benefit Athens. As a punishment, Athens should now benefit Socrates. This was the punishment Socrates put forward at his own trial. The jury was not impressed. His accuser suggested that Socrates should be executed, and a jury of his peers selected that punishment for Socrates. But even though Socrates has been punished to death, and indeed he does wind up dying, and there's a record of that in another Platonic dialogue, even though Socrates has been sentenced to die, he's not afraid. In fact, he declares that there's good hope that death is a blessing. Why would Socrates think this? Well, he considers any number of options. On the one hand, Socrates says, death might be like a dreamless sleep. It might be like falling asleep and never waking up. It's completely peaceful. It's the absence of consciousness. It's kind of death on this account is kind of like annihilation. There's simply no individual having thoughts or dreams or memories or, for that matter, pains and sufferings. But for that reason, Socrates thinks, if that's the option, then death is nothing to be afraid of. Who's afraid of sleeping? The other possibility, Socrates thinks, is that in death, there's an afterlife, and the soul departs the body and relocates in Hades. But this too, Socrates thinks, is nothing to be afraid of, because in Hades, there's also the souls of any number of great philosophers and actors and athletes, and Socrates in death would get to converse with all of them, to continue to examine life even in death. And that's nothing to be afraid of either. In fact, that's an advantage. So either death is like a dreamless sleep, which is a good thing, an advantage, Socrates thinks, or the soul relocates in Hades, and that's a good thing. That's an advantage. So no matter what happens after death, death is an advantage, Socrates thinks. But if death is an advantage, it shouldn't be feared. We shouldn't fear good things that are going to happen to us. We should only fear things that are bad, things that are going to be a disadvantage. So Socrates concludes, death is not to be feared. This is an incredibly famous argument. And again, at least the form of Socrates' argument is valid. So if you don't accept the conclusion, if you think that death is to be feared, or at least if you're not convinced that death is not something to be feared, you have to reject at least one of the premises.